In this lesson, we will learn about responsive web design. When we say that a website is responsive, it simply means that the website responds or adapts to the size and characteristics of the device that is viewing the page. So for example, a responsive website may use a two-column layout if someone's using a traditional desktop or laptop computer to view the page. But if someone viewed the exact same web page using a small smartphone, they would see a different layout. The page would reflow to fit the smaller screen. So things would collapse down to a single column, perhaps the navigation menu would adjust. Now in the modern era, we are so accustomed to seeing responsive websites that I think it might actually be easier to explain responsive web design by showing you an example of a website that is not responsive. So let's imagine that we designed a website with laptops and desktop computers in mind. Now, if we did not code the page to be responsive, if we viewed the exact same page on our smartphone, the text would be so small that it would be impossible to read, and we would have to do the annoying task of pinch zooming in to read specific portions of the page, and then scrolling and unpinch zooming and repinch zooming. I'm sure that you've come across websites like this before, and I will assume that you did not find the experience very enjoyable. Most users, if given the choice between a not responsive website and a responsive website, will definitely choose the responsive route. It's much more usable for smaller screens. Now for the remainder of this lesson, we are going to roll up our sleeves and learn how to take a standard web page and make it responsive so that it will work flawlessly for any size device under the sun. Let's get started. Our recipe for a responsive website has only two ingredients at its core. The first ingredient is a meta tag that we will add to the head section of our HTML code. And the second ingredient is known as media queries, which is a fancy way of saying that we can tell our CSS to only run in certain scenarios or for certain screen sizes. So let's begin with the first ingredient in our recipe, the meta tag. Let's hop over to our text editor and edit the HTML. So here's the head section of our page. We're going to create a new line, meta. Now the meta tag that we're interested in is named viewport. Viewport refers to the web browser window area, the part of the screen that scrolls with website content. Now we are interested in adjusting the width of the viewport. We want devices to be true to themselves. So for example, certain smartphones will try and pretend like they're bigger than they really are. And that's what creates the horrible situation where you visit a website on your smartphone and everything's very zoomed out and microscopic and you have to pinch zoom in to read the text. If a particular smartphone is only 320 pixels wide, we don't want it to pretend that it's 960 pixels wide by artificially scaling and zooming out. We want it to truly act and behave as if it is only 320 pixels wide. Be true to itself. And then we as web designers can adjust our CSS to fit the content to work within that 320 pixels of width. So our code is basically saying the width of the viewport should be equal to the device width, the width of the device. And we can go one step further and say that the initial scale should be 1. So when the device first loads our website, it won't need to zoom out, it won't need to zoom in. It can simply use its natural size at its natural scale. So to review, this line of code is telling devices that they don't need to adapt to the website. And instead, it's putting the responsibility back on the website. The website needs to respond and adapt to the size of the device. Now let's head back over to our recipe. We've taken care of our first ingredient, the viewport width meta tag, and now that devices are using their true screen size, we've created an issue for ourselves that can only be solved by ingredient number 2. So for instance, here is our example layout, and this is how it appears on a laptop or a traditional desktop computer. And this is how it would have appeared on a smartphone if our website wasn't responsive. the phone would have tried to zoom and scale out to fit this layout. But because we told devices to use their true screen size, this is what the average smartphone user would see. You will recall from earlier lessons that we used CSS to create a two-column layout. Our main column should take up 66% of the width, and our sidebar should take up 34% of the width. Now the arithmetic looks correct, but it just doesn't work on such a small screen size. A screen this small should only use one column. So the green sidebar area should simply stack below the main column area, and both sections should use the full available width of the device. However, we don't want to sacrifice our two-column layout for devices that are large enough to display it in an elegant fashion. So we need a way to send different CSS instructions to different sized devices. And that is precisely what media queries allow us to do. Now let's not waste any time. We're going to hop straight into the text editor. This is a CSS file. And let's see our first media query in action. @ media, screen, and, parentheses, max width, 700 pixels. Now any code that we place between this curly bracket and this curly bracket will only be applied to the page if the browser window is no larger than 700 pixels. So this is our chance to send different style instructions to smaller screens. So we established that we don't want two columns for small screens. So we want to override these width and float properties for main area and sidebar. So within our curly brackets for the media query, we can simply say main area and sidebar. So we're selecting those two HTML elements, and we're going to say width should be auto, which will use the full available width. And for the float property, none. We don't want them to be floated. Now if we save and refresh, we can see that our two-column layout is still intact for larger screens. But if I start resizing my browser window, once we cross the threshold of 700 pixels, we will see these properties take effect. So I'm continuing to resize my browser, and we hit the 700 pixel threshold, and we can see that we now have a single column layout. And it looks like there's a bit of extra space on the right side of the main column area. That's coming from this padding right property. So let's override that within our media query. We'll select just the main area, padding right, 0. We can see that the main column now takes up the appropriate width. So our layout looks great if a device is 700 pixels wide, or in other words, a small tablet. But what if someone was using a smartphone? When we're dealing with a screen this small, the first thing that I want to address is the main horizontal margins. This is too large. And that spacing is coming from the container divs that we have for each section. Now in our CSS, we have told divs with a class of container to have 40 pixels of padding on the left and right. However, for smaller screens, we don't want that. So even though that size works for a 700 pixel wide device, it doesn't work for smartphones. So we can simply create a media query, media, screen, and max width. Now instead of providing a threshold of 700, we can say max width 480 pixels. And then any code between these two curly brackets will only be applied if the device is 480 pixels wide or smaller. So within this media query, we can select the container class and say padding left should only be 20 pixels. Padding right should only be 20 pixels. So we're overriding the value of 40 and setting it to 20. So if I refresh, we can see that the new margins free up more space for the content. Next, let's reduce the vertical space that we see here. I think that much space works for a larger device, but once we get down to the mobile level, it's too much. Now that spacing is coming from the content area div, and we've told it to have 40 pixels of top padding. So we can create a media query to override that. Media, screen, and max width we'll continue to use the 480 threshold. We'll select the same class, and then we'll simply override this value. Padding top, let's say 20 instead of 40 pixels. Much better. So we've adjusted certain values for smaller screens. What if there's content that we don't want to display at all for smaller screens? So for example, this yellow box reads, "This content is not absolutely vital and does not need to display on mobile devices." We can set up a media query to hide this content for smaller screens. So in our HTML, we can see that that content comes from this code. It's a div with a class of info box. Now we want to keep that styling intact for larger screens and larger devices, but I'm going to add on an additional class to this div named hide small. And then we're going to create a new rule in our style sheet that only targets small screens. So we'll say media screen and max width 480 pixels. Within this media query, we're going to target that class that we just added to the HTML, hide small. Display none. So now, if we refresh, we can see that for small screens, the yellow box is gone. But if we make our window larger than this threshold of 480 pixels wide, the yellow box is back. This means we have a reusable class named hide small, which we can add to any element on the page, and it will do the heavy lifting of hiding that content for small screens. So let's say we want to hide this slogan in the header. We can simply add a class of hide small, and let's imagine that we don't need frequently asked questions or links in the navigation. Class hide small, class hide small. So if we save and refresh, we can see that we're beginning to optimize the content for a smaller screen. Next, let's redesign the way our header navigation works. For a screen this size, we can simply display all of the links in one line. Once a screen gets down to about 700 pixels, I think we should style the links so that they have a bit more vertical padding so that they're easier to tap with a touchscreen device. And we should also style them so that there's only 3 per line. So to achieve this, we'll hop over to our style sheet. Here's the area of our style sheet that's styling the navigation. And we'll create a media query that targets devices that are 700 pixels wide or smaller. So first, let's write the code that makes sure that there's only 3 links per line. So we'll target the site nav element, and we're looking specifically for the list items. Site nav, list item. We'll give it a width of 33.32%. Again, we usually want our percentages to add up to 100%. So this should create 3 equal links per row. Now, our list items had a bit of margin right, so we're going to remove that so that the arithmetic concerning the width will work out perfectly. So if we save and refresh, we can see there are now 3 links per row. Now let's increase the vertical padding for each link and also add back in the spacing between the links. So we will target the link or anchor element, padding. The links originally had 10 pixels of vertical padding, so let's bump that up to 15 pixels. And they no longer need any horizontal padding because we've already taken care of the width. Let's also add a bit of margin back in. So we'll say margin right, 5 pixels, margin bottom, 5 pixels. So if we refresh, we can see that the vertical height increased so that the links will be easier to tap. And we've also added spacing around each link. Now let's go ahead and make the links use text align center. That looks much better. So our heading navigation links are now much easier to tap and interact with on a tablet. However, on a traditional smartphone, we can see that the 3 per row is not working very well. Now we can counteract this very easily with an additional media query. So our first media query was targeting devices that are 700 pixels wide or smaller. Now let's create a media query that selects only devices that are 480 pixels or smaller, And instead of using width 33%, we will select the list items and give them a width of 50%. So now only 2 per row, which is well suited for the smartphone size. With that change in place, let's take a moment to reflect on how our website is responding to the size of the device. So this is obviously what users will see if they use a smartphone. As we start to increase the size of the window or the device, we see that once we cross this threshold, we then have 3 links per row, and we're no longer hiding the yellow box content or the slogan in the header. And then once we hit this threshold, you can see we are then no longer using a single column layout, and our navigation then sits all of the links on one line. So we've created different layout experiences for different screen sizes, all thanks to media queries. Now, throughout this lesson, we've only seen one type of media query. They're all using max width. And I don't want you to get the notion that responsive web design is simply taking a website that's designed for large screens and retrofitting it to work for smaller screens. Yes, that's the example that we looked at in this lesson, but you can also build from the other direction. So really quickly, let's try an experiment. If someone's browser window is larger than 1300 pixels wide, let's increase the maximum width of our container so that the content will use maybe this much space instead. And let's also bump up the base font a bit. So let's begin by increasing the max width of the container for really large screens. So in our CSS, we can see here is the baseline style for the container div. We've already targeted it with a media query for small screens, but let's add an additional media query only for large screens. So media screen, and instead of max width, we can use min width, 1300 pixels. So now, any code between these curly brackets will only be applied if the browser window is 1300 pixels or larger. Container, max width, instead of 960, let's override that to a value of 1200. So now, we can see that our browser window is very large, and if we refresh, the content uses more of the available space. So if I resize the browser window, we can see that the threshold is crossed right there. Let's also increase the baseline font size for really large browser windows. So in our code, within this same media query that's targeting large screens, let's select the body element. Now if we scroll up to the top of our style sheet, you can see that by default, our baseline font size is 15 pixels. So in this new media query for large screens, let's target the body element and say the baseline font size should be 17 instead of 15 pixels. So if we refresh, we can see all of the font bumps up to fit the larger screen. So let's look at the threshold again. This makes effective use of larger screens. And it's all thanks to the min width media query. Now, there is no right or wrong way to build a responsive website. If you want to begin with smartphones in mind and then add min width media queries to accommodate larger and larger screens, that approach is called mobile first. You're using the mobile as your baseline. This mobile first approach is gaining more traction every year because we see that more traffic continues to come from smaller devices instead of traditional laptops and desktops. However, many developers, myself included, still prefer to design for a medium-sized laptop at first and then include media queries in either direction to accommodate different screen sizes. Again, there is no right or wrong approach. What's important is that you are creating enjoyable and highly usable experiences for all of your users, regardless of which device they're using. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. I hope that you're hungry to learn more about responsive web design, because in our next lesson, we're going to look at how to create a responsive grid. Or in other words, we will learn how to manage column layouts that are more complex than what we saw in this lesson. Now, before you hop into the next lesson, I encourage you to experiment with what you learned in this lesson. Have fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.